The glass sat on the marble countertop, innocent as morning light. Crystal clear water with just a hint of lemon, prepared exactly how Victoria Ashford liked it. What no one knew, not the chef, not the butler, not even the security cameras positioned in every corner of the estate, was that those 2 drops of clear liquid weren't lemon juice at all. They were something far more sinister, something that would stop a heart within hours if left untreated. And the only person who saw it happen, who understood what was unfolding in that pristine kitchen at 6:47 in the morning, was a woman whose name most people in the household didn't even know. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Morales stood frozen behind the pantry door, her fingers gripping the edge of the shelf so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had come down early to retrieve the special tea Victoria had requested the night before, the imported chamomile that helped with her migraines. But instead of finding an empty kitchen as expected, she found them. The twins. 17-year-old Cameron and Claire Ashford, children of billionaire tech mogul Richard Ashford, standing over their stepmother's morning water with a small vial that caught the early light like a shard of broken promises. Elena watched as Cameron tilted the vial with surgical precision, counting under his breath. 1. 2. Claire stood beside him, arms crossed, face blank as winter stone. Not a flicker of hesitation. Not a tremor of doubt. When Cameron screwed the cap back on and slipped the vial into his jacket pocket, Claire picked up the glass, swirled it gently to mix the contents, and placed it back exactly where the kitchen staff always left Victoria's morning hydration. Then they walked out, footsteps silent on imported Italian tile, as if they had simply come down for a midnight snack and nothing more. Elena remained motionless for a full 3 minutes after they left. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her throat felt sealed shut. She had worked for the Ashford family for 2 years, ever since she arrived in the country with nothing but a student visa and a desperate need to send money home to her younger sister in the Philippines. She cleaned their rooms, washed their sheets, scrubbed their bathtubs, and picked up after their careless luxury. She was invisible to them. A shadow that moved through their lives without acknowledgement or consequence. But now, in this moment, she had seen something that made her anything but invisible. She had become a witness. And witnesses, Elena knew from the hard edges of her own past, rarely survived unscathed. She could leave. Walk out of the pantry, go back to her small room in the staff quarters, pack her single suitcase, and disappear before the sun fully crested the horizon. No one would know. No one would ask. She could protect herself, protect her sister, protect the fragile life she had built from scraps and silence. That was the smart choice. The survival choice. But as she stood there, her mind replaying the cold precision in Cameron's hands and the empty cruelty in Claire's eyes, another image surfaced. Victoria Ashford, just yesterday afternoon, kneeling in the garden with dirt on her hands and a soft smile on her face as she helped Elena plant new roses along the east fence. Victoria, who always said good morning. Who asked about her family. Who, 3 months ago, had quietly paid for Elena's sister's emergency surgery without being asked, without making a spectacle, without demanding gratitude. Victoria wasn't perfect. She was sharp-tongued, demanding, and particular about every detail of her life. But she had been kind. In a house full of people who looked through Elena as if she were glass, Victoria had seen her. And now someone wanted her dead. Elena stepped out of the pantry, her decision made before her mind could talk her out of it. She moved quickly, silently, years of cleaning without disturbing anyone, having taught her how to be a ghost when necessary. The glass sat on the counter, waiting. 17 minutes until Victoria came down for her morning routine. 17 minutes to decide what kind of person Elena Morales would be when the world wasn't watching. She picked up the glass, held it up to the light, and saw nothing unusual. Of course not. Poison wasn't theatrical. It didn't glow or smoke or announce itself. It simply waited, patient and final. Elena's hand trembled slightly. She thought of her sister, Carmen, who still believed the world was a place where good things happened to good people. She thought of her mother's voice, worn and weary, telling her to keep her head down, to survive, to never get involved in things that weren't her concern. But she also thought of the woman who had looked at her, really looked at her, and asked if she was okay when Elena had been crying in the laundry room after her sister's diagnosis. The woman who had said, quietly and without fanfare, "Let me help." Elena set the glass back down. Then she walked to the staff kitchen, poured herself an identical glass of water, and returned. She stood there, staring at both glasses, her reflection distorted in the crystal. If she drank the poison one, if she took it into her own body, Victoria would be safe. But Elena would die. Unless there was an antidote. Unless someone could be convinced, quickly enough, that this wasn't an accident or a suicide or anything other than what it was. Murder. And the only way to prove it, the only way to force the truth into the light, was to become the evidence herself. Her hands moved before her fear could stop them. She switched the glasses. Hers in Victoria's spot. Victoria's poison water in her own grip. She lifted it to her lips and hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then she drank. The water was cold. Clean. It tasted like nothing at all. Elena set the empty glass in the sink, walked out of the kitchen, and made her way to the staff quarters. She didn't know how long she had. She didn't know if what she had just done was bravery or foolishness. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had just set something in motion that could not be undone. The Ashford estate sat on 42 acres of manicured perfection just outside the city, a monument to wealth so excessive it bordered on obscene. The main house sprawled across 3 floors of marble, glass, and imported wood, every room designed by architects whose names appeared in magazines Elena would never be able to afford. There were 12 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, a private gym, a home theater, an indoor pool, and a wine cellar that cost more than most people's homes. It was the kind of place that made visitors feel small, intentionally so, a reminder that Richard Ashford had built an empire and everyone else was simply living in it. Elena had arrived at the estate 2 years earlier, one of 6 household staff members who kept the machinery of luxury running smoothly. There was Mrs. Brennan, the head housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s who ran the staff with military precision. There was Marcus, the butler, who spoke in clipped sentences and never smiled. There was the chef, Antoine, temperamental and brilliant, who threw tantrums over improper plating. There was the groundskeeper, the personal assistant, and then there was Elena, the youngest and least significant, the one who cleaned bathrooms and folded laundry and polished silver that was only used twice a year for charity galas that raised money for causes the family never actually cared about. She had learned quickly how to navigate the invisible rules of the house. Never speak unless spoken to. Never make eye contact with Mr. Ashford unless absolutely necessary. Never ask questions. Never offer opinions. Never be seen or heard or remembered. She was good at it, this erasure of self, because she had been practicing her whole life. Growing up in a small village outside Manila, she had learned that survival often meant making yourself small enough to slip through the cracks of other people's attention. When her father died, her mother had worked 3 jobs to keep Elena and Carmen in school. When her mother got sick, Elena had dropped out at 16 to work in a garment factory. And when Carmen showed signs of the same illness, a genetic heart condition that required surgery they couldn't afford, Elena had done what countless women before her had done. She had left everything she knew and gone somewhere she wasn't wanted, hoping that sacrifice would be enough. The visa process had been brutal. The interviews degrading. The journey terrifying. But she had made it, and within 3 months she had found work with an agency that placed domestic workers in wealthy households. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was enough. Enough to send money home every month. Enough to slowly, painfully, watch the numbers in Carmen's medical fund climb toward the impossible total they needed. Enough to believe, on her best days, that maybe she was doing something that mattered. The Ashford family had not noticed her for the first 6 months. Richard, the patriarch, was rarely home, always traveling for business, always in meetings that lasted until midnight. When he was present, he moved through the house like a storm system, powerful and indifferent, trailing assistants and phone calls and the faint smell of expensive cologne. He never looked at Elena. Not once. She could have been a piece of furniture for all the attention he paid. The twins, Cameron and Claire, were worse in their own way. They didn't ignore her. They looked through her, as if she were a hologram, a projection that served a function but wasn't real enough to warrant acknowledgement. Cameron was the calculating one, always 3 steps ahead in every conversation, always angling for advantage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He spoke in smooth, measured tones that made everything sound reasonable even when it wasn't. Claire was the colder one, all sharp edges and contained fury, the kind of anger that didn't explode but instead froze everything it touched. They were beautiful in the way that privilege often makes people beautiful, well-dressed, well-spoken, well-positioned to inherit a world that had been built for them long before they were born. And then there was Victoria. She had arrived a year into Elena's employment, the second Mrs. Ashford, younger than Richard by 15 years, stunning in a way that made people stop and stare. She had been a curator at a prestigious art gallery before the marriage, intelligent and cultured, with a degree from an Ivy League school and a family pedigree that wasn't quite as impressive as Richard's billions but was respectable enough. The staff had whispered about her, the way staff always whispered, speculating about prenups and motivations and whether she actually loved him or just loved what he could provide. Elena had expected Victoria to be like the others. Cold. Dismissive. Performatively kind when witnesses were present but cruel in private. But Victoria had surprised her. On her 3rd day in the house, she had found Elena scrubbing the kitchen floor and had knelt down beside her, ignoring the expensive dress she was wearing, and asked if the cleaning solution was too harsh on her hands. Elena had been so startled she had barely been able to respond. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever cared. Over the months that followed, small kindnesses had accumulated like drops of water slowly filling a cup. Victoria learned her name. She asked about her day. She noticed when Elena looked tired and quietly suggested she take a break. When Elena had received the call about Carmen's surgery, the one that would cost more than she could earn in 3 years, she had broken down in the laundry room, sobbing into a pile of expensive sheets, certain that her sister was going to die because Elena hadn't been fast enough, hadn't worked hard enough, hadn't sacrificed enough. Victoria had found her there, had asked what was wrong, and had listened without judgment or interruption. 3 days later, the hospital had called to say an anonymous donor had covered the entire cost of the surgery. Elena had known immediately who it was. She had tried to thank Victoria, tried to find words big enough to hold the gratitude, but Victoria had simply smiled and said, "We take care of each other, don't we?" As if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if Elena's life mattered as much as anyone else's. That kindness had created something fragile and profound between them. Not friendship, exactly. The power dynamics were too uneven for that. But something closer to mutual respect, to recognition. Victoria saw her. And in a world where Elena had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, that recognition had felt like being pulled from drowning. Which made what the twins had done even more unforgivable. Elena lay on her narrow bed in the staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the poison to take hold. She had no idea what it would feel like. Pain, probably. Nausea. Her heart racing or slowing or stopping altogether. She had looked at her phone a dozen times, debating whether to call for help now or wait until she was sure she was dying. If she called too early, they might not believe her. Might think she was lying or confused or trying to get attention. But if she waited too long, the antidote, if there even was one, might not work. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why did they do it? What had Victoria done to provoke such calculated hatred? The twins had everything. Money. Education. Opportunity. Their futures were guaranteed in ways most people couldn't even imagine. What could Victoria possibly have taken from them that warranted murder? Elena thought back over the past few months, searching for clues. There had been tension, that much was obvious. Cameron and Claire had been cold to Victoria from the beginning, refusing to acknowledge her at family dinners, making snide comments just loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to deny if confronted. Victoria had tried, in her way, to build bridges. She had asked about their interests, attended their school events, offered to help with college applications. But every attempt had been met with icy politeness or outright hostility. Richard, for his part, had been oblivious. Or perhaps just indifferent. He didn't seem to notice the way his children treated his wife, or if he did, he didn't care enough to intervene. He was too busy building his empire, too consumed by the next acquisition, the next merger, the next billion. His family was a background detail, something to be managed by assistants and nannies and household staff. 3 months ago, something had shifted. Victoria had started spending more time in the garden, sometimes for hours, kneeling in the dirt and planting things with her bare hands. She had seemed quieter, more withdrawn, as if some internal light had dimmed. Elena had asked if she was okay, and Victoria had smiled, but it hadn't reached her eyes. Just a difficult week, she had said. Nothing to worry about. But Elena had worried anyway, because that was what you did when someone had saved your sister's life. You paid attention. You noticed when something was wrong. And now this. Poison in a glass. 2 teenagers with dead eyes and steady hands. A woman who had been kind facing a death she didn't see coming. And Elena, lying in a small room with poison in her bloodstream, waiting to see if her gamble would pay off or if she had just thrown her life away for nothing. 20 minutes after drinking the water, Elena felt the first symptoms. A faint tingling in her fingers. A slight tremor in her hands. Her heart rate picked up, not dramatically, but enough to notice. She sat up slowly, testing her body's responses, trying to catalog every sensation. The tingling spread up her arms. Her mouth felt dry. A dull ache started behind her eyes, low and persistent. She reached for her phone, her fingers clumsy now, the tremor making it difficult to unlock the screen. She pulled up the contact for Mrs. Brennan, the head housekeeper, the only person on staff who might actually listen. But before she could press call, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Quick. Urgent. And then a knock on her door, sharp and insistent. Elena's heart lurched. Had they seen her? Did they know what she had done? She stood, swaying slightly, and moved to the door. When she opened it, she found Marcus, the butler, his usually impassive face tight with concern. "Miss Morales," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Mrs. Ashford is asking for you. She's in her study. She says it's important." Elena's blood turned to ice. Victoria was supposed to drink the water by now. She was supposed to be downstairs, in the kitchen, beginning her morning routine. If she was in her study, if she was asking for Elena specifically, something had gone wrong. Or perhaps, impossibly, something had gone right. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and followed Marcus down the hallway. Every step felt like wading through deep water. The tingling in her hands had spread to her chest now, a tightness that made breathing slightly more difficult. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on not collapsing before she made it to Victoria's study. The study was on the 2nd floor, a smaller, more intimate room than the grand spaces that dominated the rest of the house. It was filled with books, art, and personal touches that made it feel like an actual room where a person lived rather than a showpiece for guests. Victoria stood by the window, her back to the door, staring out at the garden she had spent so much time cultivating. When Elena entered, Victoria turned. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. In her hand, she held the glass. The one Elena had left on the counter. The one that was supposed to be empty. Elena's legs nearly gave out. Victoria hadn't drunk it. Somehow, impossibly, Victoria had figured it out. "Sit down," Victoria said quietly, gesturing to the chair near the desk. Elena obeyed, her body moving on autopilot, her mind struggling to catch up. Victoria set the glass on the desk between them, then pulled up a chair and sat across from Elena. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and electric, until finally Victoria broke it. "I went down to the kitchen early this morning," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I couldn't sleep. Migraines again. I was going to get my water and take my medication. But when I got there, I saw you. Standing at the counter. You were holding my glass. And then you switched it with another one." She paused, her eyes searching Elena's face. "And then you drank from the glass that was meant for me." Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat felt thick. The tremor in her hands had become more pronounced. Victoria leaned forward, her gaze sharp and focused. "Why would you do that, Elena? Why would you drink something that was meant for me?" Elena's mind raced, trying to find words that would make sense, that would explain the unexplainable. She looked down at her hands, watched them shake, and realized with sudden clarity that she was out of time. The poison was working faster than she had anticipated. If she didn't speak now, she might not get another chance. "Because," Elena whispered, her voice hoarse, "they poisoned it. Cameron and Claire. I saw them. Early this morning. They put something in your water. Something that would kill you." Victoria's face went completely still. The color drained from her cheeks. For a moment, she looked like a statue, frozen in disbelief. Then, slowly, she reached for the glass, held it up to the light, and stared at it as if it were a foreign object. "You saw them," Victoria repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saw my stepchildren poison my water. And instead of telling me, instead of calling the police, you drank it yourself." Elena nodded, her vision starting to blur at the edges. "I didn't know if you would believe me. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I'm just a maid. I'm nobody. But if I drank it, if I got sick, there would be proof. There would be evidence." She swallowed hard, fighting against the tightness in her chest. "And you would be safe." Victoria stared at her, and for the first time since Elena had known her, the composed, elegant woman looked completely undone. Her hands shook as she set the glass back down. Her eyes filled with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. "You drank poison for me," Victoria said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the weight of something too enormous to fully comprehend. "You could die. You could be dying right now. And you did it to save me." Elena felt the world tilting slightly. She gripped the arms of the chair, trying to steady herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." Victoria stood abruptly, her movements sharp and urgent. She grabbed her phone from the desk, her fingers flying across the screen. "I'm calling an ambulance. Right now. We need to get you to a hospital. We need to figure out what they used. There has to be an antidote. There has to be something." Elena wanted to protest, wanted to say something about not making a scene, about not drawing attention, but the words wouldn't come. Her body felt heavy. Distant. As if she were watching everything happen from somewhere outside herself. Victoria knelt in front of her, taking Elena's trembling hands in her own. "Listen to me," she said fiercely, her voice cutting through the fog. "You are not nobody. Do you hear me? You are not invisible. You are not disposable. You saved my life. And I am not going to let you die for it." Elena met her eyes, saw the determination there, the refusal to accept what seemed inevitable. And for the first time since she had drunk the poison, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had made the right choice. Victoria's call to emergency services was sharp and commanding, the voice of someone who was used to being obeyed. She gave the address, described Elena's symptoms, and demanded the fastest possible response. Then she made a second call, this one to Richard, her voice cold and clipped. "Your children just tried to murder me," she said without preamble. "And one of our staff members drank the poison to save my life. Get home. Now." She hung up before he could respond. Elena heard all of this as if from underwater, the words muffled and distant. The room was spinning now, a slow, nauseating rotation that made her stomach clench. Victoria was still kneeling in front of her, still holding her hands, still talking, though Elena could no longer make out the words. She focused on Victoria's face, on the tears streaming down her cheeks, on the fierce, desperate love of someone fighting to save a life that the world had deemed expendable. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes, though it felt like hours. Paramedics rushed in, asking questions, checking vitals, starting in 4. Elena felt herself being lifted onto a stretcher, felt the cool metal of equipment against her skin, heard voices overlapping in urgent medical jargon. Victoria stayed by her side the entire time, refusing to let go of her hand, refusing to be pushed aside. As they carried Elena out of the study, down the stairs, through the grand foyer that had always felt like a museum, she caught a glimpse of movement on the second-floor landing. Cameron and Claire, standing side by side, watching. Their faces were pale. Their eyes wide. But there was no remorse there. No guilt. Only calculation. Only fear of being caught. Elena locked eyes with Claire for just a moment, and in that moment, she saw the truth. The twins had believed they were untouchable. They had believed that their father's money, their family's name, and their own privilege would protect them from consequences. They had believed that no one would care enough about Victoria to risk anything. And they certainly had never considered that someone like Elena, someone invisible and insignificant, would be willing to die to prove them wrong. But Elena had. She had drunk the poison. She had made herself the evidence. And now, as the ambulance doors closed and the sirens began to wail, as Victoria climbed in beside her and held her hand all the way to the hospital, Elena understood that she had done more than save a life. She had shattered the illusion that people like her didn't matter. That their choices didn't count. That their sacrifices could be ignored. The twins had made a mistake. They had underestimated the quiet girl who cleaned their bathrooms. And that mistake was about to cost them everything. The hospital was chaos. Doctors. Nurses. Tests. Questions. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting against the poison while medical staff worked frantically to identify what it was and how to counteract it. Victoria never left her side, answering questions when Elena couldn't, demanding answers when none were given quickly enough, refusing to be dismissed or placated. At some point, Richard arrived. Elena heard his voice, loud and demanding, echoing down the hospital corridor. "What the hell is going on? Where are my children? What is this about poison?" Victoria met him outside Elena's room, and though Elena couldn't see them, she could hear every word. "Your children," Victoria said, her voice like sharpened steel, "put poison in my morning water. They intended to kill me. Elena saw them do it. And instead of letting me die, she drank it herself." There was a long silence. Then Richard's voice, quieter now, disbelieving. "That's insane. Cameron and Claire would never. They're children. They're my children." "They're 17, Victoria cut him off. "They're not children. They're monsters. And if you can't see that, if you're going to stand here and defend them while the woman who saved my life is dying, then you're a monster too." Another silence. Longer this time. When Richard spoke again, his voice was strained. "We need to wait for the facts. We need to talk to the police. We need to figure out what actually happened before we start throwing around accusations." "I know what happened," Victoria said. "I saw her drink the poison. I saw her collapse. And I saw your children watching from the stairs with no remorse. No shock. Just fear of being caught." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was shaking. "I should be dead right now, Richard. Your children tried to kill me. And the only reason I'm not dead is because a woman who earns minimum wage was willing to die in my place." The conversation devolved into a heated argument, voices rising and falling, accusations and denials tangling together into an incomprehensible knot. Elena stopped listening. It didn't matter what Richard believed. It didn't matter what excuses he made. The truth was in her bloodstream. The truth was in the glass that Victoria had carefully preserved and handed over to the police when they arrived. The truth was undeniable. Hours passed. The doctors finally identified the poison, a rare compound that attacked the nervous system and heart, difficult to detect and nearly impossible to trace. There was an antidote, but it had to be administered within a specific window of time. Elena had been lucky. If she had waited even 30 minutes longer to get help, the damage would have been irreversible. As the antidote worked its way through her system, slowly neutralizing the poison, Elena felt herself coming back. The tingling subsided. The tremor in her hands eased. The tightness in her chest loosened. She opened her eyes fully for the first time in hours and found Victoria sitting beside her bed, eyes red from crying, hair disheveled, still holding her hand. "You're awake," Victoria said, and her voice broke on the words. "Thank God. You're awake." Elena tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Victoria reached for the cup of water on the bedside table, held it to Elena's lips, and helped her drink. When Elena finally found her voice, it came out as a whisper. "Did they arrest them?" Victoria nodded. "The police took them in for questioning 2 hours ago. Richard tried to stop it. Tried to call lawyers. But the evidence is too strong. They found the vial in Cameron's jacket pocket. They tested the water. It matches what's in your system." She squeezed Elena's hand. "They're going to prison, Elena. Both of them." Elena closed her eyes, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief. Sadness. Anger. Exhaustion. She had saved Victoria. She had exposed the twins. But she had also irrevocably changed the course of multiple lives, including her own. Nothing would ever be the same. Victoria leaned closer, her voice soft but fierce. "I need you to understand something. What you did, drinking that poison, risking your life for mine, it wasn't just brave. It was the most extraordinary act of love I've ever witnessed. You didn't have to do that. No one would have blamed you for walking away. For protecting yourself. But you didn't. You chose me. You chose to stand between me and death. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure that choice meant something." Elena opened her eyes, met Victoria's gaze, and saw something there that she had never seen directed at her before. Not pity. Not gratitude. Something deeper. Something that looked like family. "You saved my sister," Elena whispered. "When I had nothing. When I was no one. You gave her life. I just gave you the same." Victoria's tears fell freely now. "You were never no one," she said. "Not to me. Never to me." They sat together in the hospital room, two women from completely different worlds, bound together now by poison and sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to let cruelty win. Outside, the world was already spinning the story into headlines. Billionaire's children arrested for attempted murder. Housekeeper saves employer's life by drinking poison. It would be sensational. Scandalous. The kind of story that dominated news cycles and launched investigations and destroyed reputations. But in that quiet room, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Elena was alive. Victoria was alive. And the truth, for once, had been powerful enough to break through the walls of privilege and silence. The twins had believed they were untouchable. They had believed that money and name and status would protect them from consequences. They had believed that people like Elena were too insignificant to matter. But they had been wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. And now they would face the price of that arrogance. Elena felt herself drifting towards sleep, the exhaustion of the past hours finally catching up with her. As her eyes closed, she felt Victoria's hand still holding hers, warm and steady and real. And she thought, for the first time in a very long time, that maybe the world wasn't as dark as she had believed. Maybe kindness could ripple outward. Maybe sacrifice could mean something. Maybe even invisible people could change everything. The charges came down like a guillotine, swift and merciless. Attempted murder. Conspiracy to commit murder. Possession of a controlled substance with intent to harm. The legal language was cold and clinical, but the reality behind those words was anything but. Two teenagers, barely old enough to vote, were facing the possibility of spending the next 20 years behind bars. The media descended on the story like vultures on carrion, every news outlet from local stations to national networks fighting for exclusive interviews, insider details, anything that would keep the scandal alive for one more news cycle. Richard Ashford's legal team moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Within hours of the arrests, a crisis management firm had been hired, a team of criminal defense attorneys assembled, and a public relations strategy deployed. The narrative they attempted to construct was one of troubled youth, mental health struggles, and the immense pressure of growing up in the shadow of impossible expectations. They painted Cameron and Claire as victims themselves, children who had lost their mother too young and struggled to accept a replacement, who had acted out in a moment of temporary insanity brought on by grief and confusion. The problem with that narrative was Elena. She had seen their faces. She had witnessed the cold calculation, the steady hands, the complete absence of remorse. And she refused to let them rewrite what had happened. When the prosecutors came to interview her, still recovering in her hospital bed with Victoria sitting protectively beside her, Elena told the truth in careful, precise detail. She described the morning. The pantry. The vial. The deliberate, measured way Cameron had counted the drops. The blank expression on Claire's face. The silence that followed. She didn't embellish. She didn't exaggerate. She simply stated what she had seen, and that testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Richard's legal team couldn't attack Elena directly without looking monstrous, so they attacked her credibility instead. They questioned her immigration status, implying she might have ulterior motives for fabricating such a serious accusation. They suggested she was trying to extort money from the family. They pointed out that she had been alone when she witnessed the alleged poisoning, that there were no cameras in that particular part of the kitchen, that her word was the only evidence linking the twins to the crime beyond the physical poison itself. They never explicitly called her a liar, but the implication hung in the air like smoke, choking and pervasive. Victoria became a fortress around Elena. She hired her own attorney, a fierce woman named Margaret Chin who specialized in protecting vulnerable witnesses. She gave interviews to carefully selected journalists, speaking about Elena's character, her kindness, her integrity, and the debt of gratitude she owed her. She released a statement that left no room for ambiguity, stating that she believed Elena completely, that she trusted her account without reservation, and that she would stand by her no matter what legal or social consequences followed. The statement sent shockwaves through the Ashford family's social circle. Friends who had attended the wedding 2 years earlier now found themselves forced to choose sides. Some quietly distanced themselves from Richard, uncomfortable with the implications of defending children accused of attempted murder. Others closed ranks, citing loyalty and the presumption of innocence, insisting that everyone deserved a fair trial. But the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The image of Elena, a young immigrant woman who cleaned toilets for a living, drinking poison meant for her wealthy employer, was too powerful to ignore. It cut through class lines and political divisions. Conservative commentators praised her sacrifice as an example of noble service. Progressive activists held her up as proof of the exploitation inherent in the domestic labor system. Religious leaders cited her actions as Christ-like selflessness. Everyone wanted to claim her story, to use it to reinforce whatever worldview they already held. Elena found it all deeply uncomfortable. She hadn't drunk the poison to become a symbol or a martyr. She had done it because someone had been kind to her, and kindness, in her experience, was too rare to let it be extinguished without a fight. The hospital released her after 4 days. The poison had been successfully neutralized, though the doctors warned her that there might be lingering effects, fatigue, occasional tremors, possibly some nerve damage that would take months to fully heal. Victoria wanted her to stay at the estate, offered her a guest room in the main house, but Elena declined. She needed distance. Space to process what had happened. The staff quarters felt too close to the scene of everything, too tangled in the memories of that morning. Instead, she moved temporarily into a small apartment that Victoria rented for her in the city, a modest one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew her face or her story. Carmen called from the Philippines every day, her voice bright with relief and pride and worry all tangled together. Elena tried to downplay what had happened, but Carmen had access to the internet and had read every article, watched every news clip. "You could have died," Carmen kept saying, as if repetition would somehow make Elena understand the magnitude of what she had risked. Elena didn't know how to explain that dying had seemed, in that moment, less terrible than living with the knowledge that she could have prevented a death and chosen not to. Some things couldn't be translated across the phone line, couldn't be made to fit into words that carried the full weight of what they meant. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the arrests. Elena was required to testify, to repeat her account under oath in front of a judge, the defendants, and their army of lawyers. Margaret Chen prepared her carefully, explaining what to expect, how to answer questions, how to stay calm under cross-examination. "Don't let them rattle you," Margaret advised. "Don't let them make you angry or defensive. Just tell the truth. The truth is your strongest weapon." Elena nodded, but privately she wondered if truth was ever really enough when it was pitted against power and money and the kind of privilege that had always allowed people like the Ashfords to rewrite reality to suit their needs. The courthouse was surrounded by media on the day of the hearing. Cameras lined the steps. Reporters shouted questions that blurred together into an incomprehensible roar. Elena walked through it all with her head down, flanked by Victoria on one side and Margaret on the other, both women forming a protective barrier between her and the chaos. Inside, the courtroom was quieter but no less tense. Cameron and Claire sat at the defense table, dressed in carefully chosen outfits that made them look younger and more innocent than they were. Cameron wore a suit that was just slightly too big, making him appear smaller, less threatening. Claire had her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, projecting vulnerability. It was theater, Elena realized. All of it. Every detail calculated to elicit sympathy. When Elena took the stand, she felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice steadier than she felt. The prosecutor led her through her testimony, asking her to describe what she had seen, when, where, and how. Elena recounted the morning in the same careful detail she had given in her earlier interviews. She spoke slowly, clearly, making sure every word landed with precision. She didn't look at the twins. Didn't allow herself to be distracted by their presence. The cross-examination was exactly as brutal as Margaret had warned it would be. The defense attorney, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a voice like honey over gravel, approached her with a kind of false gentleness that set her teeth on edge. "Miss Morales," he began, his tone almost sympathetic, "you've been through a terrible ordeal. No one disputes that. But I need to ask you some difficult questions. Is that all right?" Elena nodded. He smiled, as if grateful for her cooperation. "You say you saw my clients, Cameron and Claire Ashford, putting something into a glass of water on the morning in question. Is that correct?" "Yes," Elena confirmed. "And you were hiding in the pantry at the time?" "I wasn't hiding," Elena corrected. "I was retrieving something." The attorney raised an eyebrow, as if this were a significant distinction. "But you didn't announce your presence? You didn't let them know you were there?" "No," Elena said. "I didn't." "So you were, in effect, spying on them?" "Objection," the prosecutor interjected. "Argumentative." "Sustained," the judge said. The defense attorney continued, unfazed. "Miss Morales, how far away were you from the counter where this alleged poisoning took place?" Elena thought for a moment. "About 10 feet. And the lighting? It was early morning, correct? The sun wasn't fully up yet?" "There was enough light to see," Elena said firmly. "I saw what I saw." "But you didn't actually see what was in the vial, did you? You didn't see a label or a chemical composition?" "No," Elena admitted. Then how can you be certain it was poison? Because they poisoned me, Elena said, her voice rising slightly. I drank what was meant for Mrs. Ashford, and I almost died. That's how I know it was poison. The attorney paused, letting the emotion in her voice hang in the air, as if it proved instability rather than conviction. Miss Morales, he said gently, is it possible that you saw something innocent, something completely harmless, and interpreted it as sinister because of your own anxieties or preconceptions? No, Elena said. That's not what happened. But you were under a great deal of stress at the time, weren't you? Financial stress? Family stress? You were supporting a sick relative back home, is that correct? Objection, the prosecutor said again, her voice sharp. Relevance? The judge hesitated, then nodded. I'll allow it, but get to the point, counselor. The defense attorney turned back to Elena. You were desperate for money, weren't you, Miss Morales? Desperate enough to do almost anything to keep your sister alive? Elena felt her chest tighten. I sent money home, yes. But that has nothing to do with what I saw. Doesn't it? The attorney pressed. Isn't it true that accusing my clients of a serious crime has resulted in significant financial support from Mrs. Ashford? That she's paying for your housing, your legal representation, your medical bills? Victoria is helping me because she's kind, Elena said, her voice shaking now. Not because I'm lying. But you can see how it might look to an objective observer, can't you? How it might seem like you have a financial incentive to maintain this narrative. I'm not lying, Elena repeated, louder now. I saw what I saw. I drank poison. I almost died. That's not a narrative. That's the truth. The judge intervened. That's enough, counselor. Move on. The defense attorney smiled slightly, as if he had already accomplished what he intended. No further questions, Your Honor. Elena stepped down from the stand feeling like she had been flayed open, every vulnerability exposed and weaponized against her. Margaret squeezed her shoulder as she returned to her seat. You did well, she whispered. He didn't shake you. Elena wasn't sure that was true. She felt shaken. Hollow. As if the attorney had reached inside her and pulled out every doubt and insecurity she had ever felt about her own worth and held them up for the entire courtroom to examine. Victoria testified next, her composure unshakable. She described finding Elena in the kitchen, switching the glasses, drinking the poison. She spoke about Elena's character, her integrity, the absurdity of suggesting she would fabricate such a story for money. When the defense attorney tried the same tactics with her, implying that her loyalty to Elena was clouding her judgment, Victoria shut him down with a precision that bordered on surgical. My judgment, she said coldly, is based on the fact that I am alive because of her. If you're suggesting that gratitude for someone saving your life constitutes bias, then yes, I am biased. And I'm not ashamed of that. The courtroom stirred. The judge called for order. The defense attorney wisely chose not to push further. The toxicology reports were entered into evidence. The vial found in Cameron's jacket matched the poison found in Elena's system. The water from the glass Victoria had preserved showed traces of the same compound. The defense argued that anyone could have planted the vial, that the twins were being framed, that there was no direct evidence linking them to the act beyond Elena's testimony. But the circumstantial evidence was damning. The twins had motive, they had openly resented Victoria, had made comments to friends about wishing she would disappear. They had opportunity, they lived in the house, had unrestricted access to the kitchen. And they had means. The vial had been purchased online using a credit card linked to Cameron's account, paid for with a gift card to avoid direct detection, but the digital trail still existed. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Bail was set at $2 million each, an amount Richard paid without hesitation despite the protests of the prosecution. Cameron and Claire were released into their father's custody with strict conditions. They were not to leave the state. They were to wear ankle monitors. They were to have no contact with Victoria or Elena. The media frenzy intensified. Every day brought new revelations, new think pieces, New hot takes. True crime podcasters dissected every detail. Armchair detectives debated the twins' guilt online. Elena's face was everywhere, sometimes praised as a hero, sometimes scrutinized as a potential opportunist. She hated all of it. She stopped reading the news. Stopped checking social media. She just wanted to disappear back into the kind of anonymous existence she had known before any of this happened. But disappearing wasn't an option anymore. Too many people knew her face. Too many people had opinions about what she had done and why. Victoria tried to shield her from the worst of it, but there was only so much protection money could buy. Elena found herself becoming a reluctant public figure, invited to speak at events, asked to give interviews, pressured to capitalize on her moment of visibility. She declined everything. The only interview she agreed to was a single sit-down with a journalist Margaret trusted, a woman who promised to tell the story fairly without sensationalism. The interview aired on a major network during prime time. Elena spoke carefully, choosing her words with the same precision she had used on the witness stand. She talked about her family, her reasons for coming to the country, the difficulty of being invisible in spaces where your labor was needed but your humanity was not. She talked about Victoria's kindness, about the surgery that had saved Carmen's life, about the debt of gratitude that could never truly be repaid but could at least be honored. And when the interviewer asked her if she regretted drinking the poison, if she would do it again knowing what she knew now about the legal battles and media circus that would follow, Elena didn't hesitate. Yes, she said simply. I would do it again. Because some things matter more than comfort or safety. Some things are worth the cost. The interview went viral. Clips circulated for weeks. The phrase "some things are worth the cost" became a rallying cry for various movements, each interpreting it through their own lens. Elena watched it all from a distance, bemused and exhausted, wondering how her life had become something so public and strange. Richard Ashford, for his part, remained largely silent. He released a brief statement expressing support for his children and faith in the legal system, but he gave no interviews, made no public appearances beyond what was legally required. Friends who knew him said he had aged 10 years in the span of a month, that the weight of what his children had done, or been accused of doing, had broken something fundamental in him. His business empire continued to function, run by capable executives who insulated him from day-to-day operations, but his personal life had imploded. His marriage to Victoria was effectively over, though no divorce papers had been filed yet. They existed in a kind of legal and emotional limbo, bound together by the ongoing trial but separated by a chasm of betrayal and broken trust. The twins, released on bail, returned to the estate but found it transformed. The staff, those who remained, treated them with cold professionalism, speaking only when necessary, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Brennan had resigned immediately after the arrests, unable to reconcile her loyalty to the family with what had happened. Antoine, the chef, had stayed but refused to prepare meals specifically for Cameron and Claire, insisting they could order takeout or cook for themselves. The groundskeeper continued his work in silence, tending to the gardens Victoria had loved, but he left the moment his tasks were complete, unwilling to linger in a house that now felt poisoned by more than just chemicals. Cameron and Claire existed in this hostile environment like ghosts haunting their own home. They weren't allowed to leave without permission. They couldn't contact friends without supervision. Their phones and computers were monitored. Their lives had contracted to the boundaries of the estate, and within those boundaries, they were pariahs. Claire, the colder of the two, seemed to retreat further into herself. She spent hours in her room, staring at walls, saying nothing. Cameron, always the more calculating, seemed to be running scenarios in his head, looking for angles, strategies, ways to mitigate the damage. He tried, once, to speak to his father about reaching a settlement with Elena, offering her money to recant her testimony. Richard had stared at him for a long moment, then walked out of the room without a word. The message was clear. There would be no deals. No shortcuts. They had made their choices, and now they would face the consequences. Victoria moved out of the estate entirely, taking a suite at a downtown hotel while she looked for a more permanent residence. She visited Elena regularly, bringing food, books, anything she thought might provide comfort or distraction. Their relationship had shifted into something neither of them quite knew how to name. It wasn't employer and employee anymore. It wasn't even just friendship. It was something deeper, forged in crisis and sacrifice, a bond that felt almost familial. They didn't talk about it explicitly. They simply inhabited it, adjusting to this new configuration of their lives with a kind of unspoken understanding. One afternoon, Victoria arrived at Elena's apartment with a stack of papers. She set them on the table and pushed them toward Elena. "I've been thinking about what happens after the trial," she said. "Regardless of the outcome, your life has changed. You can't go back to being invisible. People know who you are now." Elena looked at the papers but didn't touch them. "What is this?" "It's a proposal," Victoria said. "I'm starting a foundation. An organization dedicated to supporting domestic workers, immigrants, people who do essential labor but are treated as disposable. Fair wages, legal protections, access to healthcare and education. All the things that should be basic rights but aren't. I want you to help me run it." Elena stared at her. "I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You know more than you think," Victoria said. "You know what it's like to be invisible. To be undervalued. To have your humanity questioned. That knowledge is more valuable than any business degree. And you'll learn the rest. We'll learn together." Elena picked up the papers, scanned the first page. It was a detailed proposal outlining mission statements, funding structures, programs, and initiatives. It was ambitious. Idealistic. The kind of thing that sounded impossible until someone actually did it. "Why me?" Elena asked. "Because you're the person who drank poison to save someone else's life," Victoria said simply. "Because you're the person who refused to be silent when silence would have been easier. Because I trust you. And because I think we can do something that matters." Elena set the papers down, her hands trembling slightly, not from poison this time but from the enormity of what was being offered. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," Victoria replied. "Take all the time you need. But know that the offer stands, regardless of what you decide. Whatever you choose, I'm with you." After Victoria left, Elena sat at the table for a long time, staring at the proposal. She thought about her mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion and died too young. She thought about Carmen, who had almost died because medical care was a luxury they couldn't afford. She thought about all the women she had known, women who cleaned houses and cared for children and cooked meals and did invisible labor that kept the world functioning while being treated as if they didn't matter. And she thought about what it would mean to build something that acknowledged their value, that fought for their rights, that refused to let them be erased. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. But it was also, she realized, exactly what all of this had been building toward. The poison. The testimony. The media circus. All of it had stripped away the possibility of returning to the quiet, invisible life she had known before. And maybe that wasn't a loss. Maybe it was an opportunity. The trial date was set for 3 months out. In that time, Elena began working with Victoria on the foundation, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. They met with lawyers to establish the legal structure. They consulted with advocacy groups to ensure they weren't duplicating existing efforts. They interviewed domestic workers, immigrants, people whose stories mirrored Elena's own, listening to their needs and frustrations and dreams. The work was hard, but it was also clarifying. It gave Elena a sense of purpose beyond just being the woman who had drunk poison. She was building something. Creating something. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was actually living. The twins' legal team tried multiple times to get the trial delayed, citing various procedural issues and requesting additional time to prepare. Each time, the judge denied the motion. The message was clear. This case would not be buried or delayed into irrelevance. It would proceed. And it would proceed soon. As the trial date approached, the media attention reached a fever pitch. Networks prepared special coverage. Legal analysts gave predictions. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Elena and condemnation of the twins. But polls didn't determine verdicts. Juries did. And juries were notoriously unpredictable. Margaret Chin prepared Elena for what was coming. The trial would be longer than the preliminary hearing. More witnesses. More evidence. More opportunities for the defense to attack her credibility. She would be on the stand for days, potentially. She would be cross-examined by multiple attorneys. They would dig into every aspect of her life, looking for contradictions, inconsistencies, anything they could use to cast doubt. "Are you ready for that?" Margaret asked. Elena met her eyes. "I have to be," she said. "Because if I'm not, they win. And I didn't drink poison just to let them win." Margaret smiled, a rare expression of approval. "Good. Then let's make sure they don't." The night before the trial began, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through her testimony in her mind. She thought about Cameron's steady hands counting drops. About Claire's blank expression. About the cold calculation of children who had been given everything, deciding that the one thing they couldn't tolerate was their father's happiness with someone new. She thought about what it meant to be so consumed by resentment that murder seemed like a reasonable solution. And she thought about what it meant to be willing to die to prevent that murder from succeeding. Both choices seemed extreme. Incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't been there, hadn't felt the weight of that moment. But Elena had been there. She had felt it. And tomorrow, she would have to make a courtroom full of strangers understand why she had made the choice she did. Her phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "Can't sleep either. Want company?" Elena smiled despite herself. "Yes." Victoria arrived 20 minutes later with tea and pastries from an all-night bakery. They sat together in Elena's small apartment, not talking much, just existing in each other's presence. At some point, Victoria said quietly, "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the jury decides, you've already won. You saved my life. Nothing can change that." Elena wanted to believe that. Wanted to accept that the outcome of the trial was secondary to the act itself. But she knew that wasn't quite true. If the twins were acquitted, if they walked free, the message would be clear. That people like them could attempt murder and face no consequences. That people like Elena were expendable. That sacrifice meant nothing when pitted against wealth and privilege. She couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't let that happen. When Victoria finally left, Elena lay back down and closed her eyes. This time, sleep came, thin and restless but enough. And when morning arrived, she rose, dressed in the simple outfit Margaret had helped her choose, and prepared to walk back into the courthouse. Back into the spotlight. Back into the fight. Because some things, she had learned, were worth the cost. And justice, real justice, was one of them. The trial would determine whether that justice was possible. Whether truth could overcome power. Whether a woman who had been invisible her entire life could make herself heard loudly enough to change everything. Elena didn't know the answer yet. But she was about to find out. The jury deliberated for 6 days. 6 days of Elena sitting in her apartment, unable to focus on anything, jumping every time her phone rang. 6 days of Victoria pacing hotel rooms and making calls to Margaret every few hours asking if there was any news. 6 days of the media camping outside the courthouse, speculating endlessly about what the delay meant, whether it indicated disagreement among the jurors or simply thoroughness in reviewing the evidence. On the 7th day, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. Elena felt her stomach drop. Margaret picked her up within the hour, and they drove to the courthouse in silence. Victoria met them at the entrance, her face pale but composed. They walked in together, the same protective formation they had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, and took their seats in the gallery. The courtroom filled quickly, every seat claimed by journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had been following the case with obsessive attention. Cameron and Claire were brought in, flanked by their defense team. They looked smaller than Elena remembered, diminished somehow by the weeks of testimony and scrutiny. Claire's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Cameron stared straight ahead, his face a careful mask of neutrality, but Elena could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his shoulders. Richard sat behind them, looking like a man who had already accepted the worst possible outcome and was simply waiting for it to be made official. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The formalities were observed with mechanical precision. Then the jury filed in, 12 ordinary people who had been given the impossible task of determining the fate of 2 teenagers accused of trying to murder their stepmother. Elena tried to read their faces, searching for some hint of what they had decided, but they gave nothing away. They had been instructed not to look at the defendants, not to show any emotion, and they followed those instructions perfectly. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes, stood when the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk accepted the written verdict and handed it to the judge, who reviewed it silently before handing it back. The foreperson was asked to read it aloud. In the matter of the State versus Cameron Ashford, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel demanding order. Elena felt Victoria's hand find hers and squeeze hard. The foreperson continued, her voice steady despite the chaos. In the matter of the State versus Claire Ashford, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Claire made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp. Cameron remained frozen, his mask finally cracking to reveal something raw and terrified underneath. Richard dropped his head into his hands. The defense attorneys immediately began conferring, preparing for the inevitable appeals process, but the damage was done. The jury had spoken. The verdict was final, at least for now. The judge called for order again, and slowly the courtroom settled. Sentencing would be scheduled for a later date, she announced. Until then, the defendants would remain in custody given the severity of the charges and the guilty verdict. Bail was revoked. Cameron and Claire were let out by bailiffs, their futures reduced to the uncertain timeline of the criminal justice system. Elena watched them go, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions she couldn't quite parse. Relief, certainly. Vindication. But also something that felt uncomfortably close to sorrow. They were 17. 18 now, actually, having had birthdays during the trial. They had made a choice that would define the rest of their lives, and that choice had been to take someone else's life. But they were still so young. Still, in some fundamental way, children who had made a catastrophic mistake. Victoria had no such ambivalence. "Justice," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Finally. They walked out of the courthouse into a wall of reporters and cameras. Questions were shouted from every direction, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Margaret and Victoria formed a barrier around Elena, guiding her through the crowd without stopping. But this time, Elena paused. She turned to face the cameras, took a breath, and spoke. What happened in that house wasn't just about one family or one crime. It was about what happens when we stop seeing each other as human beings. When we treat people as disposable. When kindness becomes so rare that risking your life to protect it seems like the only reasonable choice. She paused, letting her words settle. The foundation we're building, the work we're doing, it's to make sure that no one else has to make the choice I made. That everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from, is treated with the dignity they deserve. That's the real verdict we should be focused on. She turned and walked away, leaving the reporters scrambling to process what she had said. Victoria caught up to her, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and whispered, "That was perfect." Elena wasn't sure about that. But it was true. And truth, she had learned, was worth speaking even when your voice shook. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later. The prosecution asked for the maximum, 25 years to life, arguing that the crime was premeditated, calculated, and showed a complete disregard for human life. The defense, in a last-ditch effort to mitigate the damage, brought in psychologists who testified about the twins' mental state, their grief over losing their mother, the pressure they felt to maintain their father's approval. They painted a picture of two children who had been damaged by circumstance and had acted out in a moment of profound psychological distress. It was a compelling narrative, delivered with professional polish and strategic empathy. But it couldn't erase what they had done. Elena was asked if she wanted to give a victim impact statement. She had gone back and forth on the decision, unsure if she had anything left to say that hadn't already been said. But Victoria had encouraged her. "Your voice matters," she had said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." So Elena stood before the court one final time and spoke directly to Cameron and Claire, who were seated just a few feet away. "I don't hate you," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm angry. I'm hurt. But I don't hate you. I think you forgot that I was a person. That your stepmother was a person. That we had lives and families and people who loved us. You saw us as obstacles or inconveniences, things to be removed rather than people to be valued. And that's the tragedy here. Not just what you tried to do, but what you stopped seeing." She paused, her eyes meeting Claire's for just a moment. Claire looked away immediately, unable to hold her gaze. "I hope you use whatever time you have, wherever you end up, to remember that every person you meet is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who matters. Because that's the only way any of this means anything. That's the only way we don't just keep repeating the same cruelty over and over." Elena sat down, her hands shaking slightly. Victoria reached over and took one of her hands in both of hers, holding tight. The judge delivered the sentence without preamble. "Cameron Ashford and Claire Ashford, you have been found guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. The evidence presented in this trial demonstrated a level of premeditation and intent that cannot be excused by youth or circumstance. While I acknowledge the psychological testimony regarding your mental state, I cannot ignore the fundamental fact that you made a choice to end someone's life and very nearly succeeded. Therefore, I sentence you each to 18 years in a state correctional facility, with the possibility of parole after 12 years contingent upon demonstrated rehabilitation and remorse." The gavel fell. The sentence was rendered. Cameron's attorney immediately stood to announce their intention to appeal. Claire sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands. Richard stood and walked out of the courtroom without looking back, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a grief that had no outlet and no resolution. Elena left the courthouse for the last time feeling strangely empty. It was over. The trial, the testimony, the media circus, all of it was finally over. But the hollow feeling inside her suggested that closure wasn't quite the same thing as healing. Victoria seemed to sense her mood. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get out of here." They drove to the apartment in silence. Victoria made tea while Elena sat on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. When Victoria handed her the cup, Elena looked up and said, "What happens now?" Victoria sat beside her. "Now we build. Now we take everything that happened and turn it into something that matters. Now we make sure your sacrifice meant something beyond just this one case." The foundation launched officially 3 months later. They called it the Invisible No More Foundation, a name that Elena had suggested and Victoria had immediately loved. The mission was clear and ambitious, to provide legal support, financial assistance, and advocacy for domestic workers, immigrants, and anyone whose labor was essential but whose humanity was overlooked. They started small, a handful of staff working out of a modest office space downtown, but the response was overwhelming. Within weeks, they were receiving dozens of requests for help every day. Stories poured in from across the country, stories of exploitation, abuse, wage theft, and mistreatment. Each one was a variation on the same theme: people who worked hard, who did jobs that kept society functioning, being treated as if they didn't matter. Elena threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her. She had never imagined herself as an organizer or advocate. She had spent her entire life trying to be invisible, to slip through spaces without causing disruption. But something had shifted in her during the trial. She had been forced to stand up, to speak out, to claim space in rooms where she had never been welcome. And now that she had tasted visibility, had felt what it was like to be heard and believed, she couldn't go back to silence. She worked long hours, meeting with clients, coordinating with lawyers, appearing at fundraisers and speaking events. Victoria worked beside her, leveraging her connections and resources to build partnerships with other organizations, to secure funding, to amplify their message. They made a good team, the immigrant maid and the billionaire's widow, united by shared trauma and shared purpose. Carmen flew out to visit 6 months after the sentencing. Elena picked her up from the airport, and the moment she saw her sister, healthy and whole and grinning widely, Elena felt something inside her crack open. They hugged for a long time, neither willing to let go. "You look different," Carmen said when they finally pulled apart. "Stronger maybe." Elena laughed. "I feel exhausted." Carmen shook her head. "No, I mean it. You look like yourself, but more. Like you're not hiding anymore." Elena considered that. "You're right," she said finally. "I'm not hiding anymore. I don't know how to anymore." Carmen stayed for 2 weeks, and Elena showed her everything. The foundation office. The apartment. The places in the city she had come to know. But mostly they just spent time together, talking for hours the way they used to when they were younger, before life got complicated and geography separated them. Carmen asked about the trial, about the twins, about how Elena was really doing beneath the confident exterior she presented to the world. "I have nightmares sometimes," Elena admitted one night over dinner. "I dream that I'm back in that pantry, watching them, and I try to move but I can't. I try to scream but nothing comes out. And then I wake up and I have to remind myself that it's over. That they're in prison. That Victoria is safe." Carmen reached across the table and took her hand. "You saved someone's life," she said. "You almost died doing it. That's going to leave a mark. You don't just walk away from something like that unchanged." "I know," Elena said. "I just wish the change felt less heavy sometimes. But there were good days too. Days when a client called to say they had won their case, secured back pay, been granted asylum. Days when Elena spoke at a university and saw young people in the audience nodding along, energized by the idea that advocacy mattered, that change was possible. Days when Victoria looked at her across the office and smiled, and Elena felt the full weight of what they had built together. Those days made the nightmares bearable. Made the exhaustion worthwhile. Made the sacrifice feel like it had actually accomplished something beyond just her own survival. Richard Ashford, for his part, had retreated entirely from public life. He had stepped down from his position at the company, appointed a successor, and moved to a smaller property upstate. Occasionally, Elena would see mentions of him in business journals, brief notes about investments or board positions, but he gave no interviews, made no statements, existed only as a ghost of the man he had been. She wondered sometimes if he visited his children in prison. If he had found some way to reconcile what they had done with his love for them. Or if that kind of reconciliation was even possible. She didn't know. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Victoria finalized her divorce a year after the trial. It was a quiet proceeding, no drama or contested assets. Richard agreed to everything, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps out of simple exhaustion. Victoria walked away with a settlement that ensured she would never have to worry about money, and she poured much of it into the foundation. The work became her life, her purpose, the thing that gave meaning to everything that had happened. She and Elena were inseparable now, not romantically but in a way that transcended easy categorization. They were partners. Family. Two women who had been brought together by violence and had chosen to respond with compassion. On the anniversary of the day Elena had drunk the poison, they held a small ceremony at the foundation. Staff gathered, along with some of the clients they had helped over the past year. Victoria gave a short speech about resilience and solidarity and the importance of standing up for each other. Then she turned to Elena and said, "I wouldn't be here without you. None of this would exist without you. You gave me my life back. And then you helped me build a life worth living. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wasn't used to being the center of attention like this, wasn't comfortable with praise or recognition. But she forced herself to accept it, to let it land, because she was learning that denying your impact was just another form of making yourself invisible. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Elena and Victoria sat in the office together, drinking wine and looking at photos from the past year. There were pictures of events, of clients, of moments that had seemed small at the time but had accumulated into something significant. "You know what I realized?" Victoria said, setting down her glass. "What?" Elena asked. "That what you did that morning, drinking the poison, it wasn't just about saving my life. It was about proving that people like you matter. That your choices have weight. That you can't be dismissed or erased." Elena thought about that. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I was just scared of living in a world where kindness died and no one cared enough to stop it." Victoria smiled. "Maybe it's both." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker outside the window. Elena thought about how far she had come from that small village in the Philippines, from the factory work and the desperate scramble for survival. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed everything and gotten so little in return. She thought about Carmen, healthy and thriving, working toward her own dreams now that medical debt wasn't crushing them. And she thought about the version of herself who had stood in that kitchen, hand trembling as she lifted a glass of poison water to her lips, and made a choice that had changed everything. She had been terrified. She had been certain she was going to die. But she had also been absolutely sure that letting Victoria die without trying to stop it would have killed something essential in her, something that no amount of safety or self-preservation could replace. People called her a hero. The media had made her into a symbol. But Elena knew the truth. She hadn't been heroic. She had just been human. And in a world that often rewarded cruelty and indifference, being human, choosing connection over self-interest, had turned out to be the most radical act of all. Years later, long after the trial had faded from headlines and become just another true crime story people occasionally referenced, Elena would think about that morning. About the cold weight of the glass in her hand. About the taste of water that carried death in invisible drops. About the moment she had swallowed, knowing what it would cost and choosing to pay the price anyway. And she would think about what came after. The foundation that had helped thousands of people. The laws they had helped change. The conversations they had started about dignity and labor and what it meant to truly see another person. She would think about Cameron and Claire, serving their sentences, working through their appeals, facing the consequences of their choices every single day. She would think about Richard, alone in his grief and guilt, carrying the weight of having raised children capable of such calculated cruelty. She would think about Victoria, who had taken her second chance at life and used it to fight for people who never got second chances at all. And she would think about herself, the woman who had been invisible for so long, who had learned that visibility came with costs but also with power. The power to change things. To build things. To matter. The story could have ended differently. Elena could have walked away. Could have stayed silent. Could have chosen her own safety over someone else's life. And if she had, no one would have blamed her. The world was full of people making exactly that choice every single day, choosing not to get involved, not to risk themselves, not to complicate their lives with other people's problems. It was the reasonable choice. The smart choice. The choice that made sense if you were thinking purely in terms of self-preservation. But Elena had learned something that morning in the kitchen, something that had been reinforced every day since. That self-preservation wasn't the same thing as living. That safety bought at the price of someone else's suffering was just another kind of death. And that sometimes, the only way to save yourself was to risk everything for someone else. She had drunk the poison. She had nearly died. But she had also lived in a way she never had before. Fully. Visibly. Without apology or hesitation. And that, she thought, was worth every painful, terrifying, transformative moment of what had come after. The glass had been lifted. The choice had been made. And the world, for all its cruelty and indifference, had proven to be a place where one person's courage could still shift the balance. Where invisible people could become undeniable. Where sacrifice could spark something larger than survival. It could spark change. Elena looked at Victoria, her friend, her partner in this work that had become her life's purpose, and smiled. "We did good," she said quietly. Victoria met her eyes and nodded. "We did. But we're not done yet." "No," Elena agreed. "We're not done yet." And together, they turned back to the work, to the next case, the next person who needed someone to see them, to fight for them, to remind them that they mattered. Because that was what it meant to drink the poison and survive. Not just to keep breathing, but to use that breath to speak for those who couldn't. To stand for those who had been knocked down. To build something lasting from the ashes of what had almost been a tragedy. They had turned poison into purpose. And that was the real victory. Not the trial. Not the sentencing. But this. The continuing work of making invisible people visible. Of turning solidarity into action. Of proving, day after day, that some things were worth the cost. And that the cost, however high, could be transformed into something that healed rather than destroyed. Elena had paid with her life. And in return, she had gotten it back, not as it was, but as it could be. Full. Meaningful. Free. 5 years had passed since that morning in the kitchen when Elena had made a choice that redefined the trajectory of her entire existence. The foundation now occupied 3 floors of an office building downtown, employed 47 people full-time, and had satellite offices in 6 major cities across the country. They had helped secure legal victories for over 2,000 workers, recovered millions in stolen wages, and become a model for similar organizations being established internationally. The work had expanded beyond what either Elena or Victoria had initially imagined, reaching into policy advocacy, educational programs, and direct mutual aid for communities that had been systematically marginalized. Elena stood at the podium in a hotel ballroom, addressing a crowd of 500 people who had gathered for the foundation's annual gala. She wore a tailored dress that Victoria had insisted on buying for her, though Elena still felt slightly uncomfortable in formal attire. Public speaking had become easier over the years, but she never quite lost the flutter of nerves before stepping in front of a crowd. She looked out at the sea of faces, recognizing donors, community leaders, clients whose lives had been changed by the foundation's intervention, and staff members who had become like family to her. "When we started this work," Elena began, her voice steady and clear, "we didn't know if anyone would listen. We didn't know if the world was ready to hear what we had to say. But you listened. You showed up. You believed that dignity wasn't a privilege reserved for the wealthy, but a right that belonged to everyone. And because of that belief, because of your support, we've been able to change lives. Not just the lives of the people we directly serve, but the broader conversation about labor, about immigration, about what it means to be human in a society that too often values profit over people." She paused, scanning the room until her eyes found Victoria seated at a table near the front. Victoria smiled, a small private gesture of encouragement and pride. Elena continued. "Tonight, I want to introduce you to someone whose story represents why this work matters. Her name is Maria, and she's the reason I get up every morning and keep fighting, even when the fight feels impossible." A young woman stood from a nearby table, visibly nervous but determined. Maria was 23, from El Salvador, and had come to the foundation 6 months earlier after being denied wages by her employer for nearly a year. She had been threatened with deportation if she complained, trapped in a cycle of fear and exploitation that kept her silent. The foundation had taken her case, secured legal representation, and helped her win a settlement that not only recovered her lost wages but held her employer accountable through public exposure and legal consequences. Maria approached the podium, and Elena stepped aside, giving her the microphone. Maria spoke haltingly at first, her accent thick, her words carefully chosen. "I was scared," she said. "Scared to speak. Scared to ask for help. Scared that if I said anything, I would lose everything. But Elena, she told me something I will never forget. She said that silence protects the people who hurt us, not the people who need protection. And she was right. When I finally spoke up, when I finally asked for help, everything changed. Not just for me, but for other workers at that same company. We stood together. And we won. The ballroom erupted in applause. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Elena returned to her side, placed a hand on her shoulder, and felt the weight of why this all mattered. This wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. It was Maria. It was the hundreds of others like her who had found their voices because someone had bothered to listen. After the speeches concluded and the formal program gave way to dinner and conversation, Elena found a quiet corner near the windows overlooking the city. She needed a moment to breathe, to step away from the intensity of being the center of attention. Victoria found her there a few minutes later, holding 2 glasses of wine. "You did beautifully," Victoria said, handing her one of the glasses. Elena accepted it gratefully. "I still can't believe this is my life sometimes. That I'm the person standing at podiums giving speeches. It feels surreal." Victoria leaned against the window beside her. "You earned it. Every bit of it. You didn't just survive what happened to you. You transformed it into something that matters." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the city lights shimmer below. Then Victoria said quietly, "I got a letter last week. From Claire." Elena turned sharply to look at her. Victoria's expression was unreadable, a careful mask that suggested complicated emotions held tightly in check. "What did she say?" Elena asked. Victoria took a sip of wine before responding. She apologized. It was a long letter, 10 pages, handwritten. She talked about therapy, about the work she's been doing in prison to understand why she did what she did. She said she knows an apology isn't enough, that nothing she says can undo what she tried to do. But she wanted me to know that she's spent every day since the sentencing thinking about it. About you. About what it meant that you were willing to die to save me. Elena absorbed this information slowly. "Do you believe her?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Maybe. Remorse is easy to perform, especially when you're hoping for parole consideration down the line. But there was something in the letter that felt genuine. Pain. Shame. A recognition that she destroyed her own life along with almost ending mine." She paused. "I haven't written back yet. I'm not sure I will." Elena nodded. "You don't owe her forgiveness." Victoria met her eyes. "No. But maybe I owe it to myself. To let go of the anger. Not for her sake, but for mine." The conversation was interrupted by one of the foundation's board members approaching to introduce a potential major donor. Elena and Victoria slipped back into their public roles, smiling and making conversation, but the mention of Claire lingered in Elena's mind for the rest of the evening. She thought about the twins often, wondered what their lives looked like now behind bars, whether they had truly changed or were simply learning to perform regret convincingly. She wondered if people who did what they had done could ever be fully redeemed, or if some actions created permanent fractures that no amount of remorse could repair. The gala raised over $3 million, a record for the foundation. In the days that followed, Elena and Victoria met with the staff to plan how the funds would be allocated. New legal aid positions. Expanded mental health services for clients dealing with trauma. A scholarship program for children of domestic workers. Each decision was made carefully, with input from the communities they served, ensuring that the work remained grounded in actual needs rather than assumptions. This was the part Elena loved most, the behind-the-scenes planning that translated good intentions into concrete action. Carmen had moved to the city 2 years earlier, completing her degree and now working as a nurse at a community health clinic. She and Elena met for dinner at least once a week, maintaining the closeness they had rebuilt after years of distance. Over pasta one evening, Carmen said, "Mom would be so proud of you. You know that, right?" Elena felt her throat tighten. "I hope so. I think about her a lot. About how hard she worked and how little she got in return. About how she died believing that was just how life was for people like us. Carmen reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You changed that narrative. For her. For me. For thousands of people who will never have to accept exploitation as inevitable. That's her legacy continuing through you. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, gossip about Carmen's coworkers, plans for an upcoming holiday, the new restaurant they wanted to try. But Carmen's words stayed with Elena long after they parted ways. She had spent so much of her life feeling powerless, believing that she had no choice but to accept whatever circumstances she was given. The act of drinking that poison had been, in some fundamental way, the first time she had asserted power over her own life. Not power in the traditional sense of control or dominance, but the power of choice. The power to say that she valued something more than her own safety. That she believed some things were worth the risk. Richard Ashford died quietly in his sleep 18 months after the sentencing. The news reached Elena through a brief email from Margaret, who thought she should know. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no deathbed reconciliation. He simply ceased to exist, worn down by stress and grief and the knowledge that his children were serving prison sentences for attempted murder. His estate was divided primarily between Cameron and Claire, though substantial portions were allocated to various charities. Victoria received nothing, having already settled the divorce years earlier. Elena felt oddly neutral about his death. She hadn't known him well enough to mourn him, but she recognized the tragedy of a man who had built an empire and lost his family in the process. The twins were granted parole hearings after serving 7 years of their sentences. Elena and Victoria were notified and given the opportunity to provide statements to the parole board. They discussed it at length, debating whether their input would matter, whether they wanted to oppose parole or remain silent. In the end, they decided to write letters that neither explicitly supported nor opposed release. Instead, they described the impact of the crime, the long-term effects of trauma, and the importance of demonstrated accountability. Whether Cameron and Claire had genuinely changed wasn't something they felt qualified to determine. That judgment belonged to prison officials, therapists, and the parole board members who had access to information Elena and Victoria did not. Cameron was denied parole. The board cited insufficient evidence of rehabilitation and concerns about his psychological evaluations. Claire, surprisingly, was granted early release after 8 years, contingent upon strict conditions including continued therapy, community service, and regular check-ins with a parole officer. The decision sparked debate among those who had followed the case. Some argued that Claire had received preferential treatment because she had shown more visible remorse during the trial. Others pointed to the gender dynamics of the criminal justice system, suggesting that young women were more likely to be perceived as redeemable than young men. Elena tried not to follow the online discussions too closely. She had learned that public opinion was a fickle and often cruel thing, and engaging with it rarely led anywhere productive. Claire did not attempt to contact Victoria or Elena directly after her release. She moved to a different state, found work through a program for formerly incarcerated individuals, and maintained a low profile. Occasionally, Elena would see mentions of her in articles about criminal justice reform, usually as a case study in rehabilitation or the failures thereof depending on the author's perspective. She never knew what to feel about these pieces. Relief that Claire was rebuilding her life. Anger that she got a second chance while so many others who committed far lesser crimes remained trapped in the system. The contradictions were impossible to resolve cleanly. The foundation continued to grow. They launched an initiative focused specifically on workers in industries with high rates of exploitation: agriculture, hospitality, domestic labor, childcare. They partnered with labor unions, immigrant rights organizations, and legal aid societies to create networks of support that could respond quickly when crises emerged. Elena became a recognized voice in national conversations about workers' rights, testifying before legislative committees, contributing op-eds to major newspapers, appearing on panels and podcasts. She was offered book deals, speaking tours, positions at universities. She declined most of them, preferring to remain focused on the direct work of the foundation rather than becoming a professional activist celebrity. Victoria, meanwhile, had found her own path. She enrolled in law school at 53, determined to gain formal credentials that would allow her to represent clients directly rather than simply funding their representation. She was the oldest student in her class by decades, and she loved every minute of it. The rigor challenged her. The material gave her language for concepts she had been grappling with intuitively. When she passed the bar exam on her first attempt, Elena threw her a party at the foundation office, and the pride she felt watching Victoria take the oath to practice law was almost overwhelming. They made an unlikely partnership in nearly every way. Different backgrounds. Different ages. Different life experiences. But they understood each other in ways that transcended those differences. They had both looked death in the face and chosen to fight back. They had both been forced to rebuild their lives from fragments. And they had both learned that the only way to make tragedy bearable was to transform it into purpose. On the 10-year anniversary of the morning Elena had drunk the poison, they returned to the estate. It had been sold years earlier after Richard's death, purchased by a tech entrepreneur who had renovated extensively. But the new owners, aware of the property's history, had graciously allowed Elena and Victoria to visit the garden. It looked different now, redesigned with modern landscaping, but some of Victoria's original plantings remained, hardy roses that had survived the transition. They stood together in the space where Victoria had once knelt in the dirt, grieving a marriage that was already over even if she hadn't fully accepted it yet. Where Elena had watched from windows, wondering about the sadness she saw in the woman everyone else perceived as having everything. "You know what I realized recently?" Victoria said, breaking the silence. "What?" Elena asked. "That morning, when you drank the poison, you didn't just save my life. You saved my sense of hope. I had been living in that house feeling like I was slowly disappearing, like nothing I did mattered, like I was just an ornament in someone else's life. And then you did this impossible, beautiful, terrifying thing. You reminded me that people could still surprise you. That courage still existed. That connection still mattered." Elena felt tears forming but didn't try to stop them. "I didn't feel courageous. I felt terrified." Victoria smiled. "That's what courage is though. Doing the terrifying thing anyway because the alternative is worse." They walked the garden paths in silence, remembering and releasing, holding space for everything they had been and everything they had become. When they left, neither looked back. The past had its place, but they were finished living in it. The foundation's work continued. New clients arrived daily. New crises emerged that demanded response. The fight for dignity and justice was never finished, never resolved completely. But that was okay. Elena had learned that meaningful work wasn't about reaching some perfect endpoint. It was about showing up every day and choosing, again and again, to stand for something that mattered. To see people who were being overlooked. To amplify voices that were being silenced. To build systems that protected rather than exploited. She thought sometimes about the moment she had lifted that glass to her lips, about how everything that followed had hinged on that single choice. If she had walked away, if she had chosen differently, an entire alternate timeline would have unfolded. Victoria would be dead. The twins might have gotten away with it. The foundation wouldn't exist. Thousands of lives would have remained unchanged. The weight of that knowledge was staggering. How much could turn on one decision made in a handful of seconds? But she also knew that she hadn't really chosen at all, not in the sense of carefully weighing options and selecting the most advantageous path. She had simply acted according to who she was, according to values she hadn't even known she held until they were tested. And maybe that was the real lesson. That we don't become who we are in moments of calm deliberation, but in moments of crisis when there's no time to think, only to act from the deepest truth of ourselves. Elena had acted. She had drunk the poison. She had nearly died. And in doing so, she had discovered that she was far stronger, far braver, and far more capable of changing the world than she had ever imagined. That discovery had been worth every painful step of the journey that followed. She wouldn't go back and undo it even if she could. Because this life, this work, this purpose she had found, was worth the cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.